So thank you guys all for coming out today to listen to my workshop on managing emotions through movement. All right, so we're going to go into what is emotion. Emotion is a complex, subjective, conscious experience that combines cognitive states, psychosomatic expressions, and biological reactions. So physiologically, you might see a bodily arousal resulting from an emotion, so things like an increased heart rate. Cognitive emotions are conscious experiences that can be justified or interpreted, and behavioral, overt expressions that are displayed as a result of emotional experience. So facial expressions, voice, body posture, these are all things that go into behavioral. Humans have 6 basic emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and disgust. And these are further broken down into positive and negative emotions. And we are all motivated by our emotions, so things that make us happy or sad. The ability to understand and express emotions starts developing from the time someone is born. Around 2 months of age, most babies laugh and show signs of fear. By 12 months, a baby can read your face to understand what you're feeling. Most toddlers and young children use words to express their feelings, though tantrums happen when feelings get too big for their words. During childhood and adolescence, children continue to build self-regulation, empathy, and the ability to recognize and respond to other people's feelings. And by adulthood, people are able to quickly recognize subtle emotional expressions. Keep in mind that this is all typical for a neurotypical individual. So when a person has autism, a lot of times there's a myth that children with autism don't experience emotions, but this could not be more far from the truth. Children with autism have just as many emotions as anyone else. They might just have a different way of expressing that and may just need more help letting out the emotions in a more productive manner. So babies who have autism recognize feelings in a similar way as their neurotypical peers, but are slower to develop emotional responses. By 5 to 7 years, these children can recognize happy and sad, but they have a harder time with more subtle expressions of fear and anger. By adolescence, teenagers with autism still aren't very good at recognizing fear, anger, surprise, and disgust as their peers. And as adults, people with autism continue to have trouble recognizing emotions. So let's go a little bit into some of the anatomy of a brain with autism. So we have a corpus callosum, which is this thick band that contains over 1 million nerve fibers, and it divides the cerebrum into 2 hemispheres of right and left. Now, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and that's the area that's responsible for creativity, imagination, motor skills, feelings, and rhythm. And the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, and that's the area responsible for logic, mathematics, language, facts, and analysis. The corpus callosum is known to be smaller or sometimes even absent in a person that has autism, and that results in difficulty with collaborative tasks that require both hemispheres. So movement and music together exercise the visual, the gross motor, and the audio processing parts of the brain. And participating in activities that require full brain collaboration encourage the brain to build that connective tissue, which assists in more effective collaboration between the 2 hemispheres. And this will be helpful to remember and keep in mind when we talk about movement later on. Emotions come from an interplay of the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. This includes the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. And body regulation is a balance of these 2 systems together. You can think of the sympathetic nervous system like the accelerator of a car, and the parasympathetic nervous system like the brakes. When a person becomes dysregulated, one system takes over, so we have to find a way to bring the person back to balancing both of those systems. The right hemisphere of the brain houses the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic, and the sympathetic nervous systems. And it also processes social and emotional information, it facilitates attachment functions, and it helps a person to be able to cope with stress. In this way, regulation of the body and emotion go hand in hand, and it's experience dependent, so a person needs to go through specific experiences for development. Emotional regulation is the ability to monitor feelings, evaluate emotional and physical responses, and modify emotional reactions in order to accomplish a goal. Dysregulation can be further broken into underregulated and overregulated. So with underregulated, a person cannot sense their emotional experience. They can't sense their environmental triggers and therefore have no internal mechanism to self-soothe. So we see a lot of common behaviors like impulsive reactions, physical acting out, frequent meltdowns, poor concentration, and irritability. When a person is overregulated, they can sense their emotions, but they have difficulty listening to them. And the person can modify or suppress the emotional experience, and this is seen in terms of withdrawal, isolation, compulsion, anger, and aggression. In autism, even in those that are high functioning, someone may behave in a way that surprises or shocks the people around them. So we might see something like an odd reaction. So that might be a person who sees their friend fall on the playground and laughs at them because they don't understand that that person is hurt. They might have a meltdown where there's tears and shouting. They might run away. This is actually very common in children with autism. They try to leave a difficult situation, and sometimes this leads to something very dangerous, like running into a busy street. So they might not be able to process that logical information about the situation, and they can become aggressive to the self or to others. Some common coping behaviors: self-isolation, biting and/or motor stimulation, repetitive patterns in play, communication, and familiar daily events, vocal stimming, intense attachments to favorite objects, and excessive avoidant or intense seeking of particular sensory experiences. And these are all behaviors that we might observe when someone becomes dysregulated. We want to take into account that there are many different reasons why a person with autism acts out. It might be social reasons. So, for example, I was a tourist in China in the summer, and nobody spoke English. So I had a really hard time understanding what was happening around me. And this is sometimes what our children with autism experience. The world is flying by them, and they can't really process or make sense of, what's funny or typical things that we experience, but they might not have an understanding of. Intellectual is another reason that someone with autism may act out. Also experiencing sensory difficulties like sensory overload. A person may be bombarded with all the sounds and textures and noise going on around them. And you can think of it as like one big traffic jam where all the emotions are hitting a person at once and it becomes too overwhelming for them to manage. Also, face perception. So there was an interesting study that was done that found that children with autism actually scan faces differently. So people with autism scan faces in a more randomized way and focus more on the mouth, whereas neurotypical individuals tend to focus more on the eyes. So they get less information about how a person's feeling because they're not looking at the eyes and they're focused more on the mouth. Individuals commonly feel embarrassed or ashamed or sad after an episode. There are many blogs where people with autism post about how they almost attribute it to like a blacking out type episode where they've kind of forgotten that they've had this whole emotional experience. And many people on the blog also post about alienation of friends or peers because of intense emotions. So how do we recognize emotions? We look at facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice. Emotional recognition is a key skill that impacts a child's ability to understand and describe what others may be thinking or feeling. In autism, emotional management is challenging because of the difficulty recognizing their emotions and linking them to a particular event that preceded it. Many times, dysregulation arises suddenly, and there's little warning given. There's also this interesting idea of theory in mind, which says that the ability to attribute mental states to oneself and others, and to understand that others have beliefs and desires and perspectives that are different from their own. This is a very challenging area for people that have autism. They can't understand that my feelings might be different than your feelings or your feelings. So we're going to take a little quiz. This is a great social intelligence quiz that I found. And it's made by researchers in the 1990s from Britain. And all you're going to see are people's eyes. And there's going to be 37 pictures, and you'll have 4 options of different emotions, and you'll have to choose which option the person is feeling. So we're going to go through it together, but I also have hard copies. So if anyone needs a hard copy or a piece of paper, feel free to raise your hand, and my occupational therapy intern, Jasmine, will be passing out those papers. So we'll give just a minute in order to do that. This first one is going to be just a practice one, so don't put too much thought into it. This is an example of how it's going to look. You're going to see a person's face just by the eyes, and you'll pick which of the 4 emotions you believe the person is experiencing. How we doing, guys? Anyone need another minute or two? Okay. Right, I'm going to reload the test so we can go over the answers. All right, so we'll go through the practice question first. This face is panicked. All right. Number 2, the correct answer is playful. Number 3, upset. Number 4, desire. Number 5 is insisting. Number 6 is worried. Number 7 is fantasizing. Number 8 is uneasy. Number 9 is despondent. Number 10 is preoccupied. Number 11 is cautious. Number 12 is regretful. Number 13 is skeptical. I think they spelled it wrong. Number 14 is anticipating. Number 15 is accusing. Number 16 is contemplative. Number 17 is thoughtful. Number 18 is doubtful. Number 19 is decisive. Number 20 is tentative. Number 21 is friendly. Number 22 is fantasizing. Number 23 is preoccupied. Number 24 is defiant. 25 is pensive. 26 is interested. 27 is hostile. 28 is cautious. 29 is interested. 30 is reflective. 31 is flirtatious. 32 is confident. 33 is serious. 34 is concerned. 35 is distrustful. 36 is nervous. And last but not least, 37 is suspicious. So you can now add up your totals and see what you get. So I heard some happy people, some groans. If you didn't do as well as you thought you would, don't worry. The average score for this test was a 26 out of 36, because remember the first one is a practice question, so it doesn't count. The test was, again, developed in Great Britain in the 1990s, and all the images are pulled from magazines. So if you didn't do that well, it could be for a number of reasons. People who weren't from Great Britain or were from cultures that were very different from Great Britain sometimes scored lower. Also, if English is not your first language, you may have scored lowered. And also your lighting, your mood, fatigue, there's all these other factors that could be taken into account to maybe explain why you didn't do as well. So I'm sure you guys are all very good at reading emotions. And if you missed any answers, I'll have the paper available at the end, so you can come up to me and you can ask me whatever numbers you missed. All right, so now that we all know how well we can read emotions, let's talk about how we go about teaching emotions. So facial expressions. A 2015 study found that children with autism are able to differentiate between emotions, but they require more prompting to identify the appropriate label. So something that was useful is having picture cards of different emotions, very simple, clear emotions, like a picture of a birthday party, and you might ask the child, how is the birthday boy feeling? And if you do it in this way, it's in a way that's less pressure, and it doesn't have the same type of importance as a social situation because they're doing it not in that context. And it gives that person the knowledge and confidence that they later need to do it in an actual social situation. Using eye contact and movement, Temple Grandin said, "I had no idea that people communicated feelings with their eyes. I also did not know that people get all kinds of little emotional signals which transmit feelings." So in her book titled Social Problems, Understanding Emotions and Developing Talents, she goes into more detail about how she recognizes emotions of others during social interactions. And she uses those same interactions to think about new experiences that she might encounter. Looking at tone of voice, so picking out a sentence or two from a book and reading it with different tones of voice. I remember I used to do that all the time when I was younger. So you might have somebody exclaim excitedly, angrily, nervously. Using a recording is very helpful. So you can either record yourself and ask the child what emotion my tone of voice indicates, or you could have the child record him or herself and then have them state what tone they're using to indicate an emotion. And this familiarizes a person with different tones that someone might use to communicate their feelings, and it can make them more aware of their own tone during a conversation. Also using body language. So some children with autism are actually good at IDing body language since it doesn't require eye contact, but this is not the case for everyone. So they suggest drawing cartoons. So you might draw somebody who's confused, so they're scratching their head, or they're angry, so they're stomping up and down. And you can draw, again, the emotion and have the child indicate what emotion is being depicted, and then have the child draw their own emotion. And in doing that, it allows the person to develop ownership of the topic, and it helps the person to relate these ideas to real-life situations. Communicating feelings can be really challenging, so an AAC device or sign language is useful for nonverbal individuals. Also using an emotions wall, like what's being pictured here, so the person can go up and indicate how they're feeling based on this board. Social stories is another great tool to use. It can be a simple story, like a mother telling her child to do chores and the child gets very angry because he's playing his video game. But you want to use a social situation that the child can relate to. So if a child doesn't do chores, then you want to pick something that the person's going to be familiar with and that they can actually apply to their own life. Also emphasizing extreme reactions. So in a situation where a child gets very angry and hits their friend, you want to let the person know that there are other ways to express that emotion and let them know that it's okay to have these feelings, but it needs to be let in a more appropriate manner that's beneficial for both parties. And then you can present the same social situation but have an alternate ending with a more appropriate response. Like maybe instead of getting angry and punching your friend, you tell the teacher. Dr. Marsha Linehan worked with severely depressed people who were not responding to typical psychotherapy treatments. And she recommends an exercise called self-soothe, which uses 5 senses to self-soothe. And this type of technique worked well for people with autism too. So we'll go into each of them a little bit more in depth. With vision, she says to buy a beautiful flower or painting, something you enjoy looking at, go outside, look at the stars, take a sight that you enjoy and let its beauty calm you. With hearing, listening to sounds that are calming, going into nature and hearing what's around you. With smell, maybe light a scented candle, go into nature and smell the fragrances from the forest. With taste, have some of your favorite foods and savor that taste. With touch, Temple Grandin invented a hug machine, so she put herself in this machine to give herself deep pressure input whenever she was feeling dysregulated. Other alternatives are a person could get a massage, go for a walk, they could lift weights, take a warm bath, wear comfortable clothing. So difference also between mitigating and coping. So in mitigating, the parent, teacher, or therapist makes environmental modifications to the context. And with coping, the student is taught skills to cope within that context. So for an example, if a child is having a behavior problem when they're hungry, Mitigating would be the teacher gives an extra snack to the child to dissipate that hunger. And coping would be that the student is taught to indicate on a visual board when they're hungry. So we want to train a child to name the emotion they experience, as well as how to associate it with the triggering event or incident. And this is crucial for generalization across similar instances, and therefore can help the child recognize the emotion more quickly and more effectively handle that emotion. Another good strategy is using a simple interactive game. So you could use emotional charades or a mirror game where two people are taking turns making faces in the mirror, and the other one has to guess what the face the other person is making is for that emotion. Deep breaths, helping the child learn that the feeling will pass just like a dark cloud passes on a rainy day and that the sun will shine again. Using strategies to calm and comfort themselves. Making a game plan in neutral times, so that means practicing both when the child is upset and when they're not upset. All of us get upset, and we have to learn ways to cope with those feelings. De-escalating before it escalates, that's taking a moment alone or maybe sitting and talking with someone and helping to redirect their thoughts to what's more appropriate. And this is different for everyone with what works. Finding alternative outlets when you find yourself escalating, so going for a run, drawing, writing down how you're feeling, listening to calming music, whatever works for you as an individual. Using an anger scale, this is similar to the scales that are given at hospital where you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Breaking down a challenging task into smaller components, so if you have 1 being the person can do the work completely by themselves and 5 being that this work is way too hard for me, I'm gonna need help. That's a helpful technique. Using movement exercises, which we'll talk about soon, mindfulness, yoga, and dance movement therapies. It's also important to know who to ask for help, when to ask for help, and how to ask for help. So we want to teach the kids how to do that as well. Cognitive reappraisal is changing the emotional significance of a situation by changing how one thinks about the situation or one's ability to manage the demands it poses. This is used less often in individuals with autism and therefore leads to increases in maladaptive behavior, but it's a great strategy. So here are some of the fallacies. The idea that everything is black and white. People and situations are all good or all bad. There's no gray area. Catastrophizing is blowing consequences out of proportion in a negative direction. Forecasting is predicting that everything will turn out bad. Feelings are facts is taking reality and seeing it as how you're feeling at that time. So we want to teach restructuring to respond to situations more appropriately. So, for example, if someone is worried that a dog is going to bite them, the feeling and the action is that they're scared and then they don't go to the park because there might be dogs there that might bite them. So helpful thoughts would be, okay, I'm remembering that most dogs I've encountered have been friendly and they don't bite me. And then the feeling is that the person is calm, and the action is that they can now go to a park and interact with dogs without that overwhelming fear that prevents them from enjoying their life. Making a picture board and giving opportunities to make the right decision. So using a contingency map, that's this idea that if you take away the child's computer, the child waits his turn, takes a deep breath, and then gets the computer back. And the converse of that is you take away the child's computer, the child cries, throws a fit, and then doesn't get the computer again. So it's based on their response. Using a solution organizer, so the child writes out a problem, writes out a solution and a consequence, and then the action that took place. And it's very important to teach our children flexibility. When the above strategies don't work, we need to assess, are the maladaptive strategies working better for that student? Has an alternative coping skill been taught adequately? Does the child have the necessary prerequisite skills to perform that new behavior? Does the child see the benefit of using the new behavior? Has the child had opportunities to practice this? And have they had the opportunity to practice it in an actual stressful situation? So we're going to switch gears and talk about movement now. Then we'll tie everything back in together. So 80% of people with autism have some sort of movement problem. And that can range from clumsiness or a mechanical style of walking to more profound difficulties. Although so many people with autism have movement difficulties, it's actually not a core feature of autism, so it's not required for diagnosis. Because motor problems often emerge in infancy before other features of autism, some researchers are suggesting that movement issues might be a source of social difficulties for people with autism, though others attribute it to a faulty connection between brain regions, making it difficult to incorporate visual information to movement plans. So what that basically means is the theory goes like this. Children who have trouble walking or moving around don't explore their environments as much and therefore miss out on social opportunities. And it's therefore difficult for them to learn social communication skills. And later on in childhood, the same movement difficulties prevent them from participating in group activities and further worsens the social problems. So this is a really controversial idea, but if it's true, it might mean that correcting movement difficulties could also help individuals with autism interact socially. Signs of movement difficulties begin early in life. So we might see somebody who has trouble turning over, holding their head up, and sitting up. Child might not reach for things around them. They could be late to crawl or walk, and when they do, they have asymmetric movements. So two sides of the body are doing different or not doing different things. Difficulty with complex coordinated movements like pedaling a tricycle. So a number of programs are available out there to improve self-regulation skills and emotion through movement. Vigorous activity has been proven beneficial, and using full body exercises are best. It's good to exercise in a calm and supportive environment and use positive reinforcement when possible. So this is a really interesting study called the Movers and Shakers study. It was developed in a Melbourne lab, and they used pressure sensors on a mat that spanned the length of the room, and the wires on the mat were connected to a computer, which collected data about walking speed, stride length, and distance between feet to compare the gait of children with and without autism. And they also looked at some other diagnoses like ADHD as well. They noticed that children with autism have a wide stance, and children with autism have a varied stride length and width from step to step. So the individuals, they walked on a straight line as if balancing on a tightrope, and they noticed that the children with autism had difficulty staying on the line or walking it while lined up with their feet heel to toe. The child was asked to walk fast as possible while naming different types of pets or items of furniture to reveal whether multitasking can cause difficulties to emerge. So on a playground, you don't see a child walking very slowly and silently, so you need to look at how a person is moving in their actual environment. So they found that when they were asked to do this additional task, they were even more wobbly. So that suggests that attention issues may also be a factor in the movement challenges. They then used a 3D tracking system to measure the movement of the limbs and the torso. Markers were placed on the shoulders, elbows, chest, back, hips, thighs, knees, calves, and ankles. And 4 additional sensors were placed around the forehead with a stretchy band and a small band with 2 sensors around each wrist. And then the child appeared as a skeleton strutting across the computer screen. And we're going to take a look at what that looks like. So the study found, no shocker, that there is a great need for treatments aimed to improve motor skills. The study is currently still taking clinical observations about movement difficulties and turning it into something that's measurable and qualified. The team of researchers in Melbourne are working to develop a video game that helps children with autism learn to dance by imitating an avatar, and that will help to strengthen visual and motor connections in the brain. In another study, scientists from Rutgers and Indiana University developed a novel and objective way to diagnose and treat children with autism by focusing on the ways their brains process movement. So they used a Wii-like digital workspace with a computer screen that was loaded with short snippets of cartoons or videos or whatever the child was interested in. And the child was taught to choose and activate by waving their hand that was attached to a sensor. So the child learned which actions opened which on-screen activities. They learned which connections were behind movement and intention, and they remembered for several weeks until the follow-up session. By the end of the study, children were better able to control their bodies and understand the environment. Nerve growth factor was involved in the regulation of growth, maintenance, proliferation, and survival of certain target neurons. Chemical markers have been found which explain how a chemical is created at the junction between an axon and a muscle. And when that muscle moves, it guides the messages across the axon to the specific area for which it was intended. So we want to make the child make a movement which replicates the earliest reflective movement, which we can then assume has information to go to the exact place it was intended to go. So in the study, it was an initial period of 3 weeks that they found was necessary to make that connection. And then they assess where the connections have not yet been made, and they start from there. So they're starting at the lowest point. So if a child does not walk well, we don't start with walking, but we start with the movements prior to walking, which were not being fed for the information into the brain. So then you build on a development of skill. When the first set is performed easily and smoothly, you can add a second set in after testing. So this is the first set of exercises. They did a chair turn with the eyes closed, and then with it open, joint compressions, log rolls, both eyes closed and open, homolateral in-place movements. Then they did Maro reflex, asymmetric tonic neck reflex, visual stimulation, visual pursuits, and stimulation of cranial nerves. And this is all a bunch of exercises for the first set. So once they mastered that, which usually took 4 weeks to 2 months, you should be able to see a head righting reflex. And then they moved on to the second set of exercises, which was the marine crawl, rocking on hands and knees, and creeping forward on hands and knees. And then once that was mastered, a third set of starting to walk on a cross-pattern walking and emphasizing handedness. From there, the programs became more individualized. Another great movement exercise is a 7-minute high-intensity interval training workout. So when a person is dysregulated, the brain produces a high level of the stress hormone cortisol, and it also produces a spike in adrenaline. So these exercise activities have a lot of benefits. They increase dopamine in the brain, that lowers anxiety and reduces overall stress, and it also improves emotional regulation. So it's a really cute little handout that they have. And they're all animal-based. So I'll just go into a couple of them. Frog jumps, the person hops back and forth like a frog. They can hop in place if you have a small space. With the cheetah run, the person runs as fast as possible in one place. For the crab walk, the person sits with the knees bent, and they place their palms on the floor behind them near the hips, and then they lift the body off the ground and walk on all fours. So it's animal themed again to make it more enjoyable for children. Following these 7-minute workouts, you want to allow time for the person to stretch, slow walk to slow the heart rate, and do yoga poses to allow the heart rate to return back to normal. Always make sure to consult a doctor before starting any exercise program in children with autism. Want to start slow and monitor for signs of fatigue, shortness of breath, muscle cramping, dizziness, and ensure that the child is hydrated and well rested. It's important to do the exercises first thing in the morning, especially on school days. This will help the child to be able to start their day in a positive manner. They also provide unparalleled stimulus, creating an environment where the brain is willing and ready to learn. And in order to learn, understand, and apply new knowledge, there needs to be a proper balance of neurochemicals in the brain to be able to bind the neurons together. Otherwise, the information is not effectively retained in long-term memory. So the nice thing about this exercise also is that it's very little equipment that's required. So all you need is an interval timer, water, sneakers, music, and you can have a yoga mat if you'd like. So you'll set that timer for 7 rounds of 45 seconds of actual movement and then 15 seconds of rest, which altogether total 7 minutes. You can put on upbeat music and get ready to move. Want to do as many exercises as possible in that 45 seconds, and you want the person to be tired, breathing heavy, and have elevated heart rate by the end of it. Another great program is called Model Me Movement, Balance, Core, and Calming. It was developed by an occupational therapist. It's a video with short, easy-to-follow movement activities. There are 6 8 to 11-minute movement segments modeled by a child and then guided by an adult, and it's designed to target body coordination, body awareness, self-regulation, and overall physical well-being. The ACing Autism program was launched in 2008. That teaches basic tennis skills to children with autism. It coaches them also on social skills, so they can actually learn to interpret their competitor's movement and anticipate what their next move might be. The All Play program teaches children with autism how to play sports, and it's modified. So for all the different sports that they might use a lighter football or have a different goal line, and the person learns to interact and learns how to present themselves in a space that they can work with other people and understand physical contact in an appropriate manner. So mindfulness is another movement-based strategy, or it could be movement-based, doesn't have to be. Despite all the recent media buzz, mindfulness is actually backed by hard science. Though most of the research has been done on neurotypical individuals, a new body of light sheds information on how it could be useful for people with autism. It helps to reduce stress, depression, and aggression. It changes brain regions which are associated with emotional regulation, introspection, and awareness. It also improves parent-child relationships. It reduces parental stress and improves parental well-being and overall health, and reciprocally, that leads to better well-being in the children. So training in mindfulness also allows teachers to better regulate their reactions to stressful classroom situations. So it's really helpful for not only the child, but for the caregiver as well. In a longitudinal study and intervention, researchers had adolescents with autism learn a mindfulness exercise called the soles of the feet procedure, which shifts attention from whatever the emotional trigger is to the soles of the feet or other neutral point in the body. And one particular study found that the episodes were reduced from 14 to 20 per week to 4 to 6 per week after a 3-year follow-up while implementing the soles of the feet procedure. Some other simple exercises are bell listening. So you ring a bell. It can either be a physical one or one online. Have the student close his or her eyes and listen to the vibration of the bell. They can raise their hand once the ringing stops and then pay attention to the other sounds that they hear for 1 minute. And that helps to shift attention from the present moment and the surroundings. Number 2 is a bedtime mindfulness. The person lies in bed, closes his or her eyes, and brings attention to the various parts of the body. So you start at the toes and then slowly move up the head as you scan the body. This is a calming method that allows a person to return to their body at the end of the day, and it helps to develop gratitude. And the UCLA Semel Institute Body Scan has a nice printout, so if any of you are interested in that, you can see me after. Number 3 is a mindful walk. You walk with the child through a neighborhood, sometimes in silence, and if you do it in silence, you could have the child pay attention to what sounds they've heard and report back to you after the end of the walk with what sounds they've heard. You can also talk during the walk and guide the child through the sensations that they're experiencing, like notice the breeze through your hair, the crunch of the snow under your feet, and in a more active child, it's helpful to run, skip, or jump. Mindful breathing and meditation is the classic, what we think of when we think of mindfulness. Close your eyes, sit comfortably, direct attention to your breathing in and out. You can put your hands on your stomach and feel it rise and fall with each breath. You can repeat that for 5 cycles, and it guides the person to the present thoughts and feelings. And you can think of the troubling thoughts and feelings as deflating like a balloon. And glitter jar is a really cool strategy. You fill up a jar with water, glitter, glycerine, or baby oil, and then you shake up the jar and you watch the glitter settle after it's in this mess of swirling chaos. And it's a metaphor that relates to the internal state of mind to a visual object. So it's a fun activity to make with kids too. All right, so with yoga, a recent study about yoga and improving behaviors were actually published in the American Journal of Occupational Therapy recently. And it took challenging behaviors and it recorded them before and after a yoga intervention. And they found improvements in behaviors of children with autism who practice yoga consistently over a 16-week period. So how does yoga help to improve behavior? Well, the person performs physical postures to support sensory regulation and decrease anxiety, which directly affects emotional and behavioral regulation. So they do a sequencing of poses, and that requires the movement of one pose to the next, so you're working on sequencing skills as well. And you're also working on balance and providing vestibular input. Stretching, compressing, and deep pressure activities, as well as balancing poses, provide that proprioceptive input, and you can combine both vestibular and proprioceptive input through the poses to help balance the sensory system, and that helps to support self-regulation. Along with the breathing techniques, the yoga poses help children focus, concentrate, and have better impulse control. It helps to calm the central nervous system and release stress and emotions, and it leads to better sleep. And we all know that irregular sleep patterns and lack of sleep affects your behavior, your mood, your impulse control, and the ability to just cope with daily challenges. Also helps to teach a whole host of other great skills. Mirror therapy is a really interesting technique. Mirror neurons were first discovered in monkeys. Scientists found that certain parts of the brain were activated when monkeys watched another perform an action. So the same parts of the brain were activated when that monkey performed the same actions. And the same thing happens in humans when we see and do an action. So just by watching another person do that action, those same neurons are activated in our brains as well. So just as muscles are needed to do an action, and they're stimulated, but not activated when observing an action, the same thing happens with emotions. So the same facial muscles are stimulated by those activated with a person who's watching someone get angry. So a person experiencing, observing, and mimicking the facial expression of disgust would show that same activation in the same neural structures of the brain. So that's pretty fascinating. And it was thought previously to not occur in autism, but the current research says that it actually does occur in autism. And it might just be that the movements that the person is doing are not the same as the person who they're observing, but it's still being activated in the same way as any other person. Dance movement therapy is a really interesting technique. It is the psychotherapeutic use of dance and movements to enhance emotional, social, cognitive, and physical integration of the individual. So all types of different dance styles are implemented, and they use large motor movements, physical gestures, nonverbal communication, problem solving, movement games, and these work to address a variety of behaviors, including emotional dysregulation. And that helps with emotional regulation by providing a physical outlet for a lot of that emotional energy. It increases the body's awareness, offers the person with new abilities to cope, and it's an alternative to talk-based therapy. So we said it's different what works for everyone, so someone might not want to necessarily sit down and talk about how they're feeling, but this is a nice alternative to getting active and out there moving. Other benefits include sequencing skills and improves memory, attention and concentration, communication and social relationships, gross and fine motor skills and body awareness, patterns of movements for ADLs, body image, stimming behaviors through learning of varied movements, empathy and eye contact. And as with most other therapies, dance movement therapy is most effective when it started early on. So a nice thing about dance movement therapy is it also facilitates communication with the most cut-off aspects of the person's self and facilitates awareness of being and becoming alive that gradually enables a social process. It aims to build the relationship of the client and the therapist and improve overall socialization. So when socialization is improved, emotional regulation is improved. At times, you might have the child explore music on their own, so you put the song on and then the child can decide how they're going to move their body, and at other times you might have a more goal-oriented approach where you teach certain techniques. So some interesting ones are using a shadow. So you shut off the lights and leave one spotlight on, and the person makes different like shadow puppets or shadow movements. Echoing is the child imitates a movement and everyone else copies it. Mirroring is when the person the presenter does the action and the child copies it. Using touch can stimulate certain developed muscles in the brain, and then it's required for daily activities also, and this also helps to develop a sense of trust when you're using touch as well. And using different props like a scarf or a TheraBand, so all these different strategies that can be used to help integrate wider movements. So one study measured the effects of dance movement therapy and changes in the severity of negative symptoms in the treatment group compared to the participants who received no treatment in the control group. So there were 90 participants in the treatment group, and they received 10 weekly 60-minute sessions of dance movement therapy compared to the control group who did not. So you did 3 different mirroring exercises and then 1 verbal processing element. And another technique that I like to use sometimes in my treatment sessions is Snapchat. It's actually a great tool for emotional regulation. So in a person who's dysregulated and has these overpowering emotions, it can kind of distract them from what they're currently experiencing. It also has a lot of OT benefits like finger isolation, motor control. Also gives the person autonomy. Everyone knows they have all those little fun filters. The person can swipe to decide which filter they want to put on for their face. It's a good incentive for positive reinforcement. So often we give food-based reinforcers, and this is a nice alternative to something non-food-based. Using Snapchat also improves body awareness and grounds the person in reality, because they have to understand there's not actually a cat on top of my head. Relating to the therapist and other adults, many of the filters have 2 different faces, so you have to figure out where you are in relation to another person and understand where your body is in space, because if you move out of the lens of the camera, the filter goes away. So I just want to make the note of, if you're going to use Snapchat, make sure you're complying by HIPAA regulations and don't actually send any of the Snapchats. All right, so we're going to break up into small groups now. Let's see, maybe around 7 or so per group, and I'm going to pass out some scenarios based on some of the information that we learned about emotional regulation, and you're going to answer some questions that are given in the scenario, and then we'll come back together and regroup and discuss what you came up with.